Hello everybody and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we're going to continue where we last left off. In our last lecture we sort of came to the conclusion of the Hellenistic period in the Near East. We touched on the rapid breakdown of the Argead or the Macedonian Empire following the death of Alexander III in Babylon in 323 BCE. His family went into rapid decline afterwards. It was a rather a sorrowful ending for a dynasty that had endured for a few centuries and that was finally getting itself together, finally getting its kingdom in order, and finally entering the world stage. The collapse of Imperial Macedon, the collapse of the new imperial dynasty, the Argead dynasty, led to the splintering of the Near East. And at this point, we can include the Greek world into our definition of the Near East. We can put Egypt in there because they're all interconnected, not just by the trade routes, but by the governing bodies. In Egypt, the Ptolemaic dynasty is in control, and they're stretching out into the eastern, the provinces of the southern shore along the eastern Mediterranean. They're coming very close to actually recreating the old empire under the 18th dynasty. At the height of the 18th dynasty, they're approaching the size of that empire, with of course the exception of not being able to penetrate into Nubia. The Ptolemaic dynasty, for the most part, they don't really control vast stretches of the Nile. They impose themselves as a military elite over the ethnic Egyptians, but they don't venture out of the Nile marches. They restrict themselves to the Greek cities in the Nile marches, primarily at Alexandria, where they rule, and they simply use their the Greek mercenary army to corral the Egyptians, to pay them taxes, and to forward them a portion of all the grain grown. And the other states, Macedon, the Macedonian generals now ruling had kings in Macedon. They imposed themselves over the Greeks. Asia Minor is swallowed up by the Seleucid state, which at one point stretches from Asia Minor, the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, all the way to the borders of the Hindu Kush, though they rapidly lose power in the Hindu Kush. And it is actually to India that we're turning to right now, and we're looking primarily at the Mauryan dynasty of India, and they sort of rise in the out of the shadows of the great Macedonian Empire, the Argead Empire, and the eastern and just to get back to it, the eastern fringes of that empire after the death of Alexander and the division amongst the Diadochi, the successors, quickly fragments. The eastern fringe quickly fragments, and they begin to take their own course, their own course, their own development that emerges separate from the shared collective course of the Near East, the Iranian Plateau, the Aegean world, the Nile Valley, basically all the other civilizations. The eastern fringes break off. In the Indus River Valley, two rulers in particular, Chandragupta Maurya and Ashoka Maurya, they rise up, and they create the largest empire then seen in Indian history. It remained the largest Indian political state until the establishment of the modern nation of India. Now, each of Alexander's generals, as I said, they carved out their own empire. They carved out their empire, their own empires, and they supplanted the rightful Argead kings. These successors and their heirs, they fought each other for primacy for over 300 years. Each king, each one of the kings that succeeded Alexander in these regional territories, they all dreamed of leading an epic campaign to conquer their opponents, to conquer those other states, and to reunite the old Argead empire, to reunite the state created by Alexander, and that was staffed by the military, that was protected and guarded by the military that Philip created. Now, one of these successor states to this Argead empire. And really, let me just back that up. Let me go back and say three of these successor states. I want to look at the Antigone Kingdom of Macedon, and the Antigone Kingdom of Macedon ruled over the Greek city-states as well. They were ruled over by the by the descendants of the general Antigonus the One-Eyed. We had the Seleucid Kingdom, of course, and the Seleucid Kingdom was a very powerful composite state, and had I stated that its rule initially extended all the way to the Hindu Kush, but it loses the eastern fringes of its territory, and it is instead primarily based in Mesopotamia, the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, the portions of Asia Minor, and at times it is able to project into Persia. And this is ruled over by Seleucus. Seleucus was, of course, one of the assassins, one of the men who killed Perdiccas as he was marching on Macedon to uproot Ptolemy. Seleucus and his successors, they ruled this area, and the cities of Seleucia, Adtigra, and of course Antioch are founded by these men, by this man's family. And of course Ptolemaic Egypt, we already discussed that. And now these states, these Macedonian states were governed by Philhellenes. That is, the native Macedonians ruled, has native style kings, but they espoused Greek culture, Greek language, and Greek traditions. They imported it, and many aspects, well, not many, but a few aspects were taken up. But again, Greek did not hold on in the countryside. In the cities, it was very pronounced, but in the countryside, nobody abandoned speaking, let's say, Aramaic in favor of Greek. It was not the popular language. It's not like how we can jump forward to, let's say, the year 200 AD, and around the Mediterranean bases, people are speaking Latin, have the lingua franca. People are speaking Latin. Latin culture takes root in the countryside. Latin culture, this identity of viewing yourself as a Roman citizen is in full effect by the year by the year 200. It's in full effect, and by 300, these people are Romans. In the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Western Mediterranean, these people view themselves as Romans. These people use the Latin language. The Latin is fully entrenched. Greek never, during the 300 years that these Philhellene kings rule, they don't establish the type of mechanism, the type of social mechanism, the type of social instruments to really make their Philhellenism stick. It will be rapidly overplayed by Latin, by the Latin culture of the Romans, which will be also replaced by the later Arabic culture of the Islamic conquerors in the 600s. And moving on from there, we can now focus entirely on what was happening in the Indus River Valley. Indian sources state, and this is, again, gets another sort of one of those tie-in mythological tales. These sort of tie-in mythological tales meant to legitimate somebody that ties them to Alexander III. Indian sources state that while Alexander was in Egypt, in India, while he was enjoying the Indian phase, the Eastern phase of his career, he met with local Indian elites. And among these local elites was a young dynast by the name of Chandragupta Maurya, and this was a fated meeting, because Chandragupta Maurya was fated to create the next great empire in Indian history. About the time that he reached his majority, he was already an experienced, a seasoned campaigner in the Indus Valley in northern India. He had already developed the tools and the strategies that would help him to unite the petty kingdoms of northern India. The fact that we do not have any evidence of a large centralized territory or state in Indian history before his has really led a lot of people to believe that he was influenced by Alexander III to go out and forge an empire of his own. Now, some scholars believe that Alexander III's conquest illustrated how an aspiring conqueror would be able to unite the smaller petty states, particularly the smaller petty states in northern India, into a larger empire. Now, Chandragupta's empire was centered on the Ganges River, so he's not a dynast from the Indus Valley. He the dynast from the Ganges, from the other side of the Indian subcontinent on the other great river system of northern India. But he expanded his domains and conquests all the way eastward until he captured the region of the Indus Valley. Now, eventually, the majority of the Indian subcontinent fell to his control, except for the very southern tip. In the north, he contested lands with Alexander's successors, and he absorbed the smaller region before butting heads with the Seleucid Empire in Mesopotamia. Well, not really Mesopotamia, but along the Hindu Kush. Seleucus and Chandragupta fought a major battle, and it seems like Chandragupta may have gotten the upper hand based off of the peace treaty. And this peace treaty was signed in 305. And that peace treaty established the Hindu Kush as their border. And this is a really significant development because it represents a territorial gain for Chandragupta, who was also given one of Seleucus's daughter in marriage. One of Seleucus's daughters was married to Chandragupta, and Seleucus, in return, he received 500 Indian war elephants, which he immediately used to attack his western rivals. He unleashed Indian warfare for the first time in the combat of the Mediterranean, for combat in the Mediterranean. Now, Chandragupta's successors his success has sometimes been attributed to a chief minister, Kautilya, who is really credited with writing some of the more well-known advice manuals, but particularly well-known for well-known in to Western audiences. One of the what do you call them? Trying to think of the name. The Arthur Shastra. He's credited with writing one of those, and these ruler advice manuals are it kind of fits the mold of Machiavelli's The Prince, although I would say that The Prince sort of falls short of the Arthur Shastra. Now, the Arthur Shastra contains mostly ruthless but practical advice for rulers, such as weaker powers pursuing peace with stronger kings being aggressive, the type of diplomatic relations that can exist between states, and when each relationship should be pursued. Now, ruling with wisdom and justice also comes into play with the Arthur Shastra, examining what is best for the state, the best way to educate and train a royal dynasty, the future leaders of the family of the state, and how best to manage kingdoms, especially powerful kingdoms with powerful vassals, and how best to manage the ambitions of ministers. Now, Chandragupta appears to have followed that bit of advice strongly because he organized huge firings in India in every class and in every profession. And the core lesson of this work, the core lesson of the Arthur Shastra, is to create a strong, centralized state and to ward off anarchy with danger. Now, the Mauryan capital was at a place called Pataliputra, and it is located close to the contemporary city of Patna in India, and it was a very large cosmopolitan city on the Ganges River at its height. The city stretched along the Ganges River for about 8 miles and was protected by a 900-foot protective moat, which was supported by a wooden wall with over 500 towers. Now, the city boasted great cultural landmarks like a university, a library, parks, temples, all of the great social traffic that we would expect in a city thus far. Organization was a strong point for the Mauryan kings. Roads were constructed to link the great city together, and the roads even had milestones and rest stops, mango trees for shade, and the mango trees served a dual purpose for the travelers on the road. It not only provided shade to the travelers, but it also gave them a quick source of food. You can rest beneath the mango tree and enjoy mango. Now, the Mauryan government was very proactive in ensuring that mining, shipbuilding, weaving, spinning, weapons manufacturing, and even prostitution were overseen by the state, and the Mauryan government actually ran a lot of these industries as state monopolies, along with standardizing the currency, standardizing the weights and measurement systems. The Mauryan state operated farms and granaries and owned all of the forests within their domain. Now, there were strict regulations in all fields to guarantee standards, and there were fines and even harsher punishment for rule breakers. An example would be fining launderers for not beating clothes against smooth stones. Doctors who lost patients were punished, and this is seen as the precursor to medical malpractice laws. The Mauryans also maintained a very large professional army, which was composed of infantry units, cavalry units, chariotries, a chariotry unit, and a war elephant unit. Well, actually, a few war elephants units. To meet the cost of this great imperial expense of regulating so many industries, maintaining his firing, and of course maintaining that large army, the king levied taxes on every form of wealth, from crops to land to goods to animals, and of course to trade revenue. The Mauryan kings also maintained firm diplomatic and economic links with their Hellenistic counterparts to the west. The little pockets of Greek cultures left behind by the Macedonian conquest, it actually served the region well. It influenced the traditions of northern Indian art, namely statues of the Buddha, were influenced by the Greek pockets left behind. Chandragupta's reign lasted for roughly half a century, and he left behind a successful empire to his son, who really didn't add much in terms of administration or territory to his inheritance. Now, Chandragupta's grandson, Ashoka Maurya, he became the most famous of all of the Indian rulers, and he's really remembered now in the Indian tradition and in the world tradition as one of the greater kings of his generation, of his age. And he's remembered as Ashoka the Great. Now, Ashoka, his accomplishments were largely forgotten until the 19th century. And that's because the 19th century archaeologists in India discovered rocks and pillars with messages on them that were all raised by Ashoka. And they display, and these monuments really display, and they point out to all observers the royal edicts being issued forward from this king. Now, the royal edicts displayed Ashoka's belief and on how and really illustrated on how he wanted his subjects to live and how he wanted to govern his empire. Ashoka became king after beating out a sea of rivals, including beating off 6 of his own brothers to gain control of the imperial throne. After gaining the kingship in around 261 BCE, Ashoka, he settled in for a long reign. He reigned for about 30 years. For the early years of his reign, he continued the pattern of conquest established by his grandfather, by Chandragupta. And Ashoka was a formidable general and a very skillful warrior. He was absolutely ruthless in combat. And after a bloody conflict known as the Kalinga War, in which 100,000 people were killed, and another 100,000, well, an estimated 100 to 150,000 people were enslaved. Ashoka began to have a change of heart. He witnessed the suffering firsthand. He witnessed the suffering brought about by these military campaigns, and he had an abrupt change of heart because of it. He renounced warfare. He embraced the concept of nonviolence, and we know this because he recorded this on pillar inscriptions. Ashoka converted to Buddhism, and he sought to spread the religion. Now, the idea of nonviolence, of being nonviolent and extending nonviolent, compassionate animals was really revolutionary for the world for that time. And even now, those principles are known, but they've never really been pushed at a national level anywhere, really. Everyone still maintains military forces. Everybody still ventures out into committing acts of organized violence, warfare, and so forth. the compassion shown to animals led him to adopt vegetarianism. He also pursued a more humanitarian social concern throughout his empire, and he really sought to stem the suffering of his subjects. He turned to healthcare, addressing the subject on pillars. He made provisions for humans and animals to receive healthcare. He imported herbs and roots using treatments from distant locations. He had them imported into areas where they weren't common. He had them and he had people cultivate them so that they would become more prevalent, so that treatment could be more available to people. He dug up wells along roads, and planted fruit trees for the benefit of human and animals. Ashoka even begins to promote the idea of pardoning subjects for wrongs rather than just punishing them. And this begins a pattern of the rise of pardonable offenses in world history. Before then, if you committed a wrong, you were just punished. It was rather draconian in that effect. There was no sort of there was no sort of understanding other than you're guilty, we're going to punish you, and you'll be lucky if you're not killed or terribly maimed. He warns his subjects, and he refers to his subjects as his children, not to pursue actions that will result in punishment, because he still has the will and the ability to execute them, to punish them. But it's clear that from this point on, there is going to be a shift in the rule, in that they are going to take a lot more into consideration rather than just dole out harsh draconian measures. Now, to go along with the pillars, Ashoka sent out hundreds of royal officials who were charged with enforcing dharma, the ethical performance of one's duty or obligation throughout the Mauryan Empire. He dispatched missionaries to spread Buddhism throughout Asia, and he sent his own children out as missionaries to enforce, not enforce, but to see that Buddhism is spread, that the principles are spread out there. One of his sons and even one of his daughters were known to have been a part of the mission sent to Sri Lanka. Now, he is reputed to have constructed over 84,000 stupas that house sacred relics and texts. He replaced the royal hunt with a pilgrimage of religious law. He traveled widely, and he tolerated other religions in his empire. Ashoka kept the Mauryan Empire unified during his reign, but it quickly fell apart after his death. After Ashoka's death, after Ashoka's death, his sons argued with one another over who would succeed to the imperial mantle. And the Mauryan Empire fragmented and went into decline, as different territories began to splinter off from it. In 184 BC, the dynasty collapsed, as the last dynast was assassinated by one of his generals. Now, after the Mauryan collapse, India was dotted once again by a number of smaller kingdoms ruled over by dynasts, and Ashoka's dream of unity perished, but his pillars remain, and they remain to us as lasting reminders of his high ideas. Now, Ashoka is remarkable for his attempt to govern a large empire, a large bit of territory that was ethnically diverse, and in a very ethical manner. And we will break here. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about the careers of Chandragupta and Ashoka Maurya. I'm Ted, and I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.